Operating an Airbus A380 is not easy. Airlines worldwide have experienced challenges taking the aircraft on at the best of times. It's not necessarily an indication that the A380 is inherently a bad aircraft, but more so its purpose isn't always fit with airlines how they may have thought of initially. During the height of the global pandemic, carriers around the world grounded the series, as you may recall, in staggering numbers. However, some did decide to retire all units of the series and thus no longer operate it. Even if demand returned with time, they were pretty adamant that it was the wrong aircraft for them. One thing also worth noting is the second-hand market for this plane. Most normal aircraft, when retired, will be sent onwards to other airlines for, say, a cheaper operation. The A380 hasn't experienced quite a similar fate. Why? Well, first and foremost is the high acquisition and operating costs associated with the plane. Airlines that initially invested in this giant aircraft did have to make substantial financial commitments, which not every single airline could make, and we saw that very visibly through Skymark Airlines and their story with the aircraft that's been covered on the channel already. But essentially, Airbus didn't believe they would be able to officially pay for the aircraft and no doubt fly it properly. But see, when the everyday airline retires these planes, they are often reluctant to sell them at a significantly reduced rate, as the residual value does remain relatively high. We're actually seeing this take place at Thai Airways, a carrier that won't fly the A380 again, but is now struggling to sell the planes for a value that it deems worthwhile. Something also worth considering is the larger gates, runways, and maintenance facilities that were created to facilitate the A380 at launch. These all represented considerable investments and meant only specific locations could actually handle the type. Another critical factor is the efficient operations that this plane lacks for the most part. All up though, this trend shifted when Hi-Fly acquired an Airbus A380 for leasing and charter services. While only lasting on the grand scheme of things a handful of years, Hi-Fly being a leading company in the industry, well, it presented a solution to customers that were after such capacity or usage for charter services. At the time of the leasing efforts from Hi-Fly, there was an ongoing crisis involving the Trent 1000 engines, which were impacting customers of the Boeing 787 series right around the world. But one of the most significant casualties many people will look at when taking a look back at this Trent 1000 nightmare was Norwegian, with their 787 fleet being widely affected. As a means to try and mitigate the loss in capacity and overall ability to offer scheduled services with the plane for, say, the duration of the groundings, it turned to Hi-Fly and, well, none other than their Airbus A380 as a capacity solution. Specifically, Norwegian eyed a deployment on the Gatwick to New York JFK segment, which was hugely lucrative but equally very competitive for the airline. It hoped flying the A380 for a certain amount of period would give it a competitive edge over, say, some of the legacy carriers that are flying between the two pairings. However, their operations with the A380 were anything but smooth, being labelled more as a disaster than anything else. Why though? Well, to begin with, there are delays to cover. It quickly became a common occurrence that once Norwegian's sole A380, if you will, was operational, it was never on time. See, New York JFK and Terminal 1, which was where Norwegian was operating, does actually have a limit on the number of A380s it can handle. Harking back to what I discussed before, the plane has struggled to adapt in certain aspects, and with Norwegian utilising the A380 and trying to put it into these dedicated gates, while given it was not a permanent operator of this aircraft, it didn't really see it in a favourable position with New York JFK when they were making use of these dedicated gates. This meant that delays occurred on numerous occasions, and not only was this hugely inconvenient for passengers who certainly made their frustrations known over time as more and more headlines were emerging over just the delays that were being incurred, but it was quickly becoming a very costly operation for the low-cost carrier that at the end of the day, wherever possible, is trying to reduce costs rather than having them continue. Claims such as 300 to 600 euros per passenger thanks to the enormous delays, led to calls for compensation and to strip the airline of its slots at the airport due to the damages that it was causing. During this period, if anything, Norwegian was causing more harm than good. While many people would label this as a stretch, especially, say, stripping them of their specific slots, during this period, the eyes of the industry were on Norwegian and these A380 operations that they just simply couldn't get right, and really highlighted the challenges of the aircraft. And with concerns also over passenger compensation too, the pressures were really beginning to reach a tipping point for Hi-Fly, Norwegian and all associated parties, as none of this was a good look. The tipping point would eventually lead to Norwegian having to scrap operations with the Airbus A380, a decision many would applaud. If Norwegian had continued with this widebody any longer, many would ask just what would have happened and how much worse it would have gotten. For Norwegian as well, it was very necessary to understand that thanks to a host of reasons, whether it be related to the 737 MAX crisis, those 787 delays, and even the A380 operations when pairing with a struggling business model that some may argue is not all that sustainable, well, their financial position, you may recall in 2019, was far from ideal. It meant that for the airline, it really couldn't afford to be taking these losses. For the carrier, we'd eventually see the main tipping point as an actual business occur by the end of 2019, when reports indicated the airline would not be able to survive 2 more weeks of regular operations. Now, as we know, it did survive. However, the only way this was made possible was thanks to major, and I want to reiterate, major restructuring. Norwegian removed all its wide-body aircraft, so at the end of the day, the aircraft it was trying to compensate by acquiring the A380 ended up being removed anyway, and it was able to move forward with a much more streamlined business, and now it focuses on European operations, thanks also to an injection of funds, shuffling of the board, and all round, you could say, a general restructuring. The company is now in a position where it can move ahead in a more positive manner. And for the first time, instead of trying to cancel operations and remove aircraft, it's actually looking towards future aircraft acquisition to meet growth opportunities. But it's been a long turnaround process, it must be said, and operations with the Airbus A380 was something that just didn't really work. There were issues upon issues, headlines upon headlines, and these planes were being delayed 5, 6, 7 hours, and while negatively impacting the airline in every single sense, for passengers that had onward connections, well, they were missing these too. Because these delays, in reality, would yes, impact that specific service, but have a rolling effect of every future flight also being delayed. It was a trap that they just couldn't seem to get out of until they removed the aircraft, period. That is going to conclude today's analysis on the A380 at Norwegian. A bit of a disaster to say the least, but I'd love to hear your take. Does this prove that operating the A380 is not as easy as some may imagine, and maybe why we haven't seen the aircraft work in so many different instances? Let me know, and thank you very much for your support. Take care, and please do be safe. I'll see you next time.